It is done, finally. My master thesis is ready and now it's time to return to more active video making. So what have I done for the past 2 months? In my master thesis I tried to apply the Peircean semiotics to society, and in this video I want to present one of my main ideas, which I call the 4 phases of society, or the 4 levels of society. Before I briefly go through the 4 phases and their meanings, it is very important to understand what I actually intend to do. Now, the 4 phases are meant to be a way of thinking, a thinking tool. With the help of these 4 phases, we should be able to inquire, explore and perceive all kinds of societal phenomena, experiences and objects. It is a way of thinking. Maybe it could be characterized as a kind of a cognitive technology or even a psychotechnology.
Now, what do I mean by a psychotechnology? Well, just like a physical tool is designed to fit the human body and enhance its performance, a psychotechnology is an information processing tool or technique that is designed to fit the mind and enhance its performance. You need a psychotechnology. You need to teach people how to break frame and make more appropriate framing.
But the main inspiration for such a tool comes from the sociologist C. Wright Mills, and more specifically from his concept of sociological imagination.
The sociological imagination enables its possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. The first fruit of this imagination and the first lesson of the social science that embodies it, sociology, is the idea that the individual can understand his own experience and gauge his own fate only by locating himself within his period.
So my task was to begin to forge a thinking tool that would help us to link our individual experiences to larger societal and symbolic processes that we are part of. This idea should be able to bridge the gap between the individual and society, a relationship that has been one of the main core problems for sociology and social theory more generally.
Individual society dualism is the most enduring theme in social psychology, but it's a problem. It's social psychology's biggest problem, maybe.
The individual and society are often seen as an antagonistic pair, where the individual wants to be free, but the society is constraining the individual. Now, of course, to a certain extent this is true, but the problem is to conceptualize the individual and society as a separate things or separate entities. What I strive to show is that individual and society are phases of a common whole. And this common whole can be best conceptualized as a semiotic communicative process, or the Semeiosis of society.
Neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both.
One last comment before we start. This idea is at its infant phase. It's a completely hypothetical theory that needs to be applied in practice in order to be tested and matured. And that is exactly the reason why I share it with you. I hope that already after this video you are able to apply this idea or way of thinking in your own experience and maybe find even some connections between your individual experience and the larger societal processes. I'll be of course posting more videos about this idea as we develop it with the help of your experiences, my dear sign lovers. But enough introduction. What are the 4 phases of society? The 4 phases are semiotic concepts developed by my favorite Peirce scholar, Vinicius Romanini. Be sure to check out his channel. The 4 phases can be inferred from a diagram called the Solenoid of Semeiosis, which presents the formal and logical structure of semiosis. A more closer look on this diagram and on the structure of semiosis remains for a future video, but let us now take a very brief look on the diagram.
In mathematics, more specifically in chaos theory, the solenoid is a strange attractor, that is a phase space which has a form of a torus that wraps around itself, but always mapping and returning to its initial point. That's what's going on in our solenoid as well. The solenoid of Semeiosis evolves in a spiral movement, but always mapping onto itself, and it does that in 4 different periods, which are described here. So, as a whole, the solenoid of Semeiosis is also returning continuously to its initial point. That is, it has no beginning nor end. It's always continuously moving, returning, mapping over itself.
So semiosis has 4 hierarchical periods, and from these 4 periods we can infer the 4 phases.
The phase means where the pulse of the solenoid is happening, where is its activity, the tension, the dynamics of the solenoid.
So the phase tells us in which period the pulse of the semiosis is situated, in which period there is an ongoing habit formation. But again, this is something that we will return to in future videos. Now, the periods and phases describe the semiosis in a very general terms. What I am striving towards is to apply these very general semiotic concepts to society. That is, the solenoid of semiosis should be able to describe the societal semiosis, hence the 4 phases of society. I call these phases as follows: the perceptive phase, the subjective phase, the intersubjective phase, and the symbolic phase. Now, this tool works in the following way. First, we choose some societal phenomena or thing, and then we explore it from these 4 phases, which could be also thought as 4 different points of view or 4 different attitudes. Next, we go very briefly through these 4 phases.
If the pulse of the solenoid is happening at the grounding period, that means that habit has not yet taken control of this period. That means that the sign itself is not pure thirdness, yes, is not completely habitual. That means that we are still paying attention to the sign itself. We are paying attention to its own qualities, the sign as such. When this is happening, we are at the perceptive level, the perceptive phase of Semeiosis. That is, we are perceiving the sign in itself.
In the perceptive phase, we concentrate on the qualities of the thing, its colors, odor, flavor, or texture. That is, we concentrate on the firstness of the thing. The perceptive phase is a phenomenological attitude where we do not judge normatively what we see. The point is to focus on the pure sensation. It is a kind of a meditative attitude where we try to let go of our expectations. When you encounter something completely novel or surprising, you are concentrating on the qualities of that thing. What is this thing? What is its meaning? When you find yourself lost in the woods, the first thing you do is to perceive your surroundings in order to find meaning or signs that would help you to find back home. Or think about infants who constantly look around and perceive things in their qualities. That is the perceptive phase or the phenomenological attitude.
When habit takes control of the perceptive phase. That means that the perceptive phase goes into a rest. It goes quietly. And then we can go up to the next phase, which will be the investigation of the dynamic object. That's why we call it investigative or inquisitive phase. That is the phase in which we are not paying attention to the sign itself as such, but we are investigating, inquiring what is the meaning, what is the dynamic object that is behind the sign. What is the form of the dynamic object the sign professes to represent? And that is the inquisitive phase.
In the subjective phase, we recognize the thing as being this or that. A table, a dog, a friend, a car, etc. At this phase, things are not simply sensations, but they acquire a meaning. Objects of experience become signs.
I'm thirsty, and I look at that glass of water. If I'm thirsty, the cup signifies something that I can use to quench my thirst, which makes it a very different thing than what it is when it's empty or when I'm not thirsty. So I'm not even going to use the same part of my brain to perceive it, because it's not the same thing in relationship to me.
However, in this phase, the meaning is more subjective. You interpret the phenomena in relation to yourself. We are, after all unique individuals with various backgrounds, experiences, attitudes, and opinions. The exact same thing can mean very different things to different people. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Or think about the times you were really angry. When you are angry, you perceive the world in a very different way. The subjective phase is then a reminder how we all perceive the world in our own subjective manner, and how even our own subjective perceptions can change based on our underlying attitudes.
When habit takes control of the inquisitive phase, then we go to the representation period, which is linked to the phase of enaction, of participation, of deliberation. That's why we call it deliberative phase. That means that we are behaving in a certain coherent way. We are participating. We are making choices about the meanings that we are finding in the previous phases.
In the intersubjective phase, we concentrate on concrete situations and on the relations that the thing has with its surroundings and with other things. We move further away from the immediate perception and try to discover the concrete behavioral habits that are manifesting in the thing. We concentrate on the habit, law or rule of which the thing is an instance of. For example, we observe how cars usually don't collide into one another because the drivers are obeying common rules or habits. Or we have a habitual knowledge on how we can use the doorknob to exit a room. We know tacitly how we can act in our environment. This kind of knowledge is often called tacit knowledge.
Tacit knowledge is knowledge we can't articulate directly in words. Thought is very much tied up with the body. So we don't hold just abstract concepts in our mind. Those concepts are tied up with kinesthetic and emotional data.
The key thing is this. In this phase, relations are always intersubjective. That means that the relations are only between existent things. The cars truly materially exist, and the drivers interpret existent traffic signs. You know how to use the door because both you and the door are existents. For example, what is the tacit meaning of a hammer? Hammer means something that you can hit nails with, take them off if needed, maybe straighten a piece of metal, or even destroy a wall. Notice how all of these are relations between existent things. The hammer functions as a functional or instrumental tool for concrete action. However, the hammer can acquire symbolic meaning, which detaches it from concrete action and situations. When the hammer becomes the symbol for the god Thor, we move to the symbolic phase.
When habit takes control of the representation period, then we go to the communication period. And when the solenoid is pulsing here, that means that we are taking self-control of the process. That means that we are sharing meaning, we are building an argument from premises, from propositions, and we are sharing it with the community of possible interpretants in a self-controlled way to build knowledge, a knowledge that can be passed to the future generations, for instance.
In the symbolic phase, we concentrate on the more abstract and virtual relations of the object. We move even further from the concrete experience, almost to a different world, the symbolic realm, if you wish. Now, here lies the most complex and maybe also the most interesting things. Religions, ideologies, languages, institutions, etc. In the symbolic phase, we understand the perceived thing as a manifestation of some symbolic structure. For example, marching soldiers is a concrete manifestation of the military institution. Or maybe we could say that running businessmen and women in the streets are one manifestation of the capitalist economic system.
I like to use the word pattern because the patterns embody themselves in stories, obviously, but also in images, also in rituals, and then also in social structure. It's like there's an invisible pattern behind the story, then the ritual, then then even in music and all these things, and it's all these same patterns. So I kind of like to see that. That's what I've been trying to do, is trying to connect those things together. I kind of like to see it as these patterns that just structure the world, basically.
Mm-hmm.
In the symbolic phase, we are interested in the symbolic structures or archetypes that manifest themselves in our experience, first as collective habits of interaction, that is the intersubjective phase, which are in turn dependent on individual recognition, that is the subjective phase, which in turn are dependent on immediate perception, which is the perceptive phase.
And in a way, it's funny because to get to true symbolism, you almost have to destroy what people usually think what it is to give meaning to something. It's like you have to go beyond the emotional or personal, version of what happens, and then go back to the really basic ground level, kind of almost, primordial experience of something. It's like, so, but you have to go beyond that psychological, literary type of interpretation to get to the baser reality.
As you notice, these phases are in hierarchical order. The perceptive phase is the most basic, and the most developed is the symbolic phase. That means that the later phases are dependent and determined by the earlier phases. Now we are able to understand what it means when we say that the solenoid maps into itself. If you think, for example, some symbolic institution, let us say police, the functioning of the symbolic institution is dependent on its power to manifest as concrete intersubjective habits or patterns of behavior. For example, the habit of pulling over when the police chases us is a manifestation of the symbolic power of the police institution. Now, in turn, this habit of pulling over is dependent on the fact that individuals subjectively recognize various things like the police siren or the lights as signs of the police, which should be interpreted by stopping the car. Finally, the subjective recognition is dependent on the perception of certain colors and sounds that we later, in the subjective phase, recognize as familiar patterns and signs. In order to interpret signs, we have to sense them. We thus see how the symbolic institution of police maps all the way back to the immediate perception of individual persons. This, I think, is where the power of this tool lies. It helps us to connect the levels of being and reveal how symbolic structures are not separate, but closely related to our immediate perceptions. Notice also how, as we move from the perceptive phase towards the symbolic phase, we simultaneously move away from immediate experience. In perceptive phase, we really live in the moment and forget who we are. In the subjective phase, we are in our heads. In the intersubjective phase, we concentrate on behavioral habits and see ourselves as part of a community. In the symbolic phase, we enter the symbolic realm, which has almost a life of its own. For example, we could philosophize about the police institution endlessly and become totally lost in our thoughts, only to notice that the police is actually still chasing us. Lastly, it is important to note that this tool does not directly reveal the symbolic structures, behavioral habits, meanings, or perceptions. The point is rather to show the connections, or better yet, the continuum between our most immediate and intimate perceptual experience and the most long-lasting and universal symbolic structures. Perception, individuals, behavioral habits, and symbolic structures are not separate things, but part of a common whole, part of the same semiotic process, the same Semeiosis.
So that's the idea in a nutshell, but what do you think? Is there something to it? I'm not sure myself, but I have noticed that it helps me to clarify all kinds of ideas and so connections between them. And what is most important, it seems to be a very fruitful way of thinking. It brings out new possibilities, shows new possible connections between ideas, and really helps me to see how my own individual experience is part of something more, part of a larger process, if you will. But try it out yourself and please share your experiences in the comments below. If you find this kind of content interesting, please consider subscribing and, most importantly, stay safe.